Welcome to the introduction of the seminar on advanced topics in animation. My name is Matthias Teschner and I'm professor for computer graphics at the University of Freiburg. Here we have the outline of this introduction. I'm going to start with an overview of our teaching and research activities, followed by a discussion of organizational aspects of this seminar. As the presentation of an animation topic is a key component of this seminar, I will discuss how to prepare and how to give the presentation. Then I briefly discuss potential topics that could be covered in a presentation in this seminar, and finally I summarize this introduction. Computer graphics addresses various topics, and here the most prominent topic is certainly rendering or the generation or synthesis of images. But graphics is also concerned with topics that are related to image generation. And here two prominent graphics areas are modeling and simulation. On the right-hand side of this slide you can see images that illustrate these three areas: modeling, rendering and simulation. You can see a surface that is represented with a set of vertices and surface patches. You can see the simulation of a fluid, and you can see the final photorealistic rendering of the scene. Now in this seminar the presentations should focus on simulation aspects. This slide summarizes our teaching activities. First of all, we offer a general introduction to computer graphics. This introduction is part of the key course Image Processing and Computer Graphics, where the introduction to graphics is combined with an introduction to image processing. In the graphics part of this course, we talk about selected aspects of modeling, rendering and simulation, with a main focus on rendering. In addition to the key course, we offer two specialization courses. One specialization course is concerned with rendering, the other one focuses on simulation. In the advanced computer graphics course, we look into so-called global illumination approaches, for instance virtuosity or stochastic ray tracing. In the simulation course, we introduce concepts to simulate deformable objects, rigid solids or fluids, and there we mainly look into particle-based approaches. In addition to these courses, we also offer seminars, an animation seminar and a rendering seminar, and we also offer all types of projects and theses. We offer bachelor projects, master projects, lab courses, bachelor and master theses. In terms of the projects and theses, we distinguish two tracks, a simulation track and a rendering track. When interested in graphics, you can either focus on simulation or on rendering. So if you are more interested in simulation, you can start with the simulation course in the winter term. In the following summer term, you could attend the key course on graphics. The key course and the simulation course are rather independent. The key course has a strong focus on rendering, so it is not necessarily a prerequisite for the simulation course. In the summer term, you could also do your lab course or attend the simulation seminar. Then in the following semester you could continue with the master project and then finally write your master thesis. In the rendering track you would start with the key course in the summer term, and then you could attend the advanced rendering course in the following winter term. In parallel you could also participate in a lab course and in a master project. Of course, you could also attend the rendering and the simulation seminars. Again, the track would be completed with the master thesis. I find it particularly important to thoroughly plan the projects and the thesis. On one hand, one could do the lab course, the master project and the master thesis in different areas of computer science. The question, however, is whether this makes sense. I would actually argue that it is better to do the lab course, the master project and the master thesis in the same area. In this case, the master thesis can be built upon the results of previous projects. This is illustrated here for both tracks. In the simulation track, for instance, one could implement a simple fluid solver in the lab course. This simple fluid solver could be extended or improved in the master project. For instance, the data structures for the neighbor search could be improved, or the pressure computation could be improved by incorporating a so-called PPE solver, where PPE stands for pressure-Poisson equation. Based on the results of the master project, it would be possible to write a master thesis that addresses very interesting, challenging and relevant aspects in fluid simulation. So in the master thesis, it would be possible to focus on a research-oriented topic. The same holds for the rendering track. In the lab course, you could start with a simple ray tracer. In the master project, this ray tracer could be extended to a sophisticated stochastic ray tracer that employs Monte Carlo integration, and the data structures for the ray traversal could be improved. Then the outcome of such a project can be the basis for a highly interesting rendering topic that is covered in the master thesis. Now, this video illustrates some aspects of our research. In our research, we focus on particle-based simulations. For instance, in this video, all objects and materials are represented with particles. The entire fluid volume is sampled with particles, the canyon is represented with particles, and also the creatures are sampled with particles. Now, the main goal in a particle simulation is actually the computation of the movement of all particles over time. Therefore, we consider forces at particles. These forces change the velocities at particles, and the particle velocities are used to advect the particles. And now we frequently compute forces at particles so that we can frequently update the velocities and the positions of all particles so that we finally end up with such simulation results. In terms of forces, we compute forces that depend on the respective material. At fluid particles, for instance, we compute a force that preserves the volume of a fluid particle. In terms of rendering, we typically do not render individual particles, but instead we render reconstructed surfaces. When the fluid volume is sampled with particles, then we reconstruct the interface between fluid and air, we represent this interface with a triangulated mesh, and then we render this mesh. Our research is not only used for animation purposes. Instead, our research can be applied to a variety of alternative application areas, for instance engineering. Here in this example, you see the simulated airflow around a car, and also the visualization looks different compared to the previous video. The underlying simulation concepts are exactly the same. The car is represented with particles, the surrounding air is represented with particles, and then we compute forces at all particles to update the velocities and positions of all particles over time, and then we end up with such a simulation result. In terms of rendering, here we employ cutting planes, and the colors indicate the velocity of the flow field at a certain position. Red indicates a large velocity and blue indicates a low velocity. In the context of engineering applications, we closely collaborate with a company with 52 Technology. 52 Technology has been founded by previous members of our group, and 52 develops simulation software with a strong focus on the automotive industry. That's it about the introduction of our teaching and research activities, and now I will continue with a discussion of organizational aspects of the animation seminar. The main purpose of this seminar is to present a graphics topic and to write a report. As we have international students at our university, I would suggest that the presentation should be given in English, and also the report should be prepared in English accordingly. However, if you prefer, you can give the presentation in German and also prepare the report in German. Nevertheless, it would be nice if at least your presentation slides would be in English. The idea behind the presentation is to familiarize yourself with the graphics topic. So the main goal is actually to prepare and present a comprehensible presentation. The presentations are typically based on scientific publications in journals or at conferences, or they can be based on book chapters. And I find it particularly important that these publications are not just reproduced for the presentations. Instead, it's typically a good idea to adapt the organization of the publication to some extent in order to compile a comprehensible seminar presentation. It is also typically a good idea to combine material from different sources. All these seminar presentations take place at the same time and in the same room as this introduction, or alternatively, they are organized as a video conference. This will be announced on our webpage as indicated here on this slide. On our webpage, you can find a link to our teaching activities where all information on all our courses can be found. And there you find a section with information on the animation seminar, in particular the schedule of all planned presentations with topics and the names of the respective presenters. Please keep in mind that the attendance of all seminar presentations is mandatory for all participants. In addition to the presentation, a written report has to be prepared. This written report should cover the topic of the presentation and should consist of approximately 10 pages. And then at the end of the semester, the presentation slides and the written report should be submitted in 2 separate PDF documents. It would be nice if the names of the documents indicate the topic and your name, the name of the presenter. The documents should be sent to me per email, and I strongly recommend that you send the documents until the last day of lectures in the current semester. If you plan to participate in the animation seminar, then you check out our webpage to make sure that your desired topic and your desired presentation date are still available. So when you go to the webpage and to the section about the animation seminar, there you find a document that contains the current schedule of the seminar with presentations that have already been registered. If you have identified a topic that you like and your desired presentation date is still available, then you send me an email where you basically state your name, your topic, and the desired presentation date. Then I will update the seminar schedule on our webpage accordingly. And please do not forget to register for the seminar in the campus management system. That's it about organizational aspects of the seminar. Now I'm going to discuss some general aspects of the seminar presentation. All presentations should be at least 25 minutes, but no longer than 35 minutes. And after each presentation, we will have a discussion of about 10 to 15 minutes. These discussions will cover technical questions, but we will also discuss the form of a presentation in order to give feedback on positive aspects and on aspects that could be improved. So, how to prepare your seminar presentation? First of all, it's important that you really know your topic. You should thoroughly examine all relevant material. In particular, it would be nice if you do not try to circumvent any problems. So, if appropriate, if required, try to incorporate additional material and investigate additional sources. If you prepare your presentation, it would be nice if you do not create too many or too few slides. Typically, we say that each slide should be shown and explained for about 1 to 2 minutes. So if you have less than 15 slides, this is typically not a sufficient number. On the other hand, if you have more than 30 slides for a 30-minute presentation, then you certainly have too many slides. Another important point is that all slides should have a uniform look. So use a template. Text should look the same or similar on all slides. Equations, image captions should look the same. And also the slide titles should look the same on all slides. Another important aspect is that the content on slides should not be too dense. It is also nice to incorporate illustrations if possible and appropriate, and also the slide title should be useful. As the presentations cover graphics topics, it shouldn't be too difficult to incorporate illustrations and images. The last important point from my perspective is a rehearsal. So please rehearse your presentation. When you rehearse your presentation, then you typically get feedback. You should consider this feedback and adapt your presentation accordingly. The next aspect that I'd like to discuss is the structure of the seminar presentation. From my perspective, the beginning of a presentation is particularly important because in the beginning, a presenter should try to arouse the interest and the attention of the audience. In the beginning, you should introduce yourself and the title of your presentation, and then you should give an overview. Here I typically prefer simple overviews. Overviews should not be too dense and they should not contain too many specific terms that you intend to explain later in the presentation. Terms whose meaning is unknown to the audience in the beginning are certainly not helpful in the overview. Also, the overview should not be too detailed. Keep it simple, as for instance, introduction, methods, results. Another option could be concepts, implementation, analysis. After that, you should give a motivation. What is the topic about? Why is it relevant? Why is it interesting? And what is challenging about the topic? These are aspects that could be discussed in the motivation part of a seminar presentation. Also try to illustrate the topic. Here we are in the animation seminar. It should be straightforward to incorporate images or videos in the motivation. Also try to explain the goal of the presentation. Try to discuss what to expect from the presentation. Which aspects will be covered, which aspects might not be addressed. So the audience should be eager to listen to your seminar talk. In terms of the main part of the presentation, there is not much to say. It is typically helpful if the presentation is structured in sections and if these sections are explicitly separated from each other. So it's typically a good idea to introduce each part of the talk and also to provide summaries for each part of the presentation. In terms of the content, the main part can cover, for instance, basics, concepts, implementations, results, analysis, or comparisons. Finally, at the end, the entire presentation should be summarized. For instance, which are the most important insights from the perspective of the presenter? Or what are pros and cons of the presented approach? Or what about potential directions for future developments in the respective area? And then finally, the presenter should thank the audience and start the discussion. In terms of preparing the used software and hardware for the presentation, everything should be checked in advance. Try to make sure that all components are working properly and that you know how to use them. For instance, if your presentation is given as part of a video conference, check your internet connection, your microphone, your speaker, and make sure that the screen sharing works. If you give your talk in a seminar room in the university, check the connection to the projector and whether the projection setup works as expected. In general, try to avoid idiosyncrasies that might irritate parts of the audience, and most important, stay in time. That's it about the preparation of the seminar presentation. Now I'd like to discuss potential topics that can be covered in seminar talks. First of all, the information on all topics for the seminar can be found on our webpage. On our webpage, there is a link to our teaching activities, and there you can find all information about this seminar, in particular one document that contains the schedule and one document that contains short summaries of all topics and also references to relevant material. Here we have an example of the information that is available on our webpage. One potential topic, for instance, is the neighbor search in particle-based fluids, and here we have a short summary of the topic and some links to PDF documents. If you are interested in that topic, if you are curious about neighbor search in particle fluids, just check out these documents and find out whether the topic would be appropriate for you. And such short summaries and also links to relevant material are available for various topics that could be covered in a seminar presentation. Here we have an overview of various topics that you could choose for the seminar. For instance, you could talk about a simulation concept. In terms of simulation concepts, we typically distinguish particle approaches and grid-based approaches. Smooth particle hydrodynamics and position-based dynamics are examples for particle-based concepts. The material point method, on the other hand, would be an example of a hybrid technique that employs both particles and a grid. Alternatively, you could also talk about rigid body simulations. Another option would be to talk about basic concepts. In our simulations, we employ a few basic concepts, for instance, from continuum mechanics. Continuum mechanics helps us to derive forces from distortions. Numerical integration schemes, on the other hand, are used to reconstruct the trajectories of particles. We remember that we compute forces at particles, and these forces are used to update velocities and positions of particles over time. And for these updates, we use numerical integration schemes. The next option would be data structures. Here we typically use space subdivision techniques or bounding volume hierarchies. In any case, these data structures are used as acceleration data structures to either accelerate the neighbor search in a particle fluid or to search contacts in rigid body simulations. Now we get to some details and we start with particle simulations. As the name suggests, particle simulations work with particles. Particles are small portions of a solid or of a fluid. They have a mass m, a volume v and a density ρ. Particles are also characterized by a position x and a velocity v. And then we consider forces F that act at a particle. And these forces change the velocity of a particle, and the velocity changes the position of a particle according to a governing equation that is indicated here. Here we have actually two governing equations, one equation for the velocity and the other one for the position. The first equation states that the force acting at a particle corresponds to the time rate of change of the linear momentum, which is mass times velocity, and the second equation says that the velocity corresponds to the time rate of change of the position. And these two equations are numerically solved with numerical integration schemes to reconstruct the unknown functions x and v over time. If we reconstruct the functions x and v over time, then we have actually reconstructed the trajectory of a moving particle, which is the goal of a particle simulation. The images illustrate the concept of a particle simulation. Typically we start with a volume, and here in this case we have a fluid volume. Then we subdivide this volume into particles to get a discretized representation of the fluid volume. And now each of these particles has some properties as already discussed. Each particle has a volume and a mass, and it is characterized by a representative position and a representative velocity. Here we have an example of a particle simulation, and the goal of the video is to illustrate that particle concepts can handle a variety of materials. All the particles are always processed in the same way. We just use different force computations for different materials. So dependent on whether a particle belongs to a fluid or to an elastic solid, we compute different types of forces. For fluid particles, we compute a compression force. For an elastic solid, we compute a compression force, but also a shear force. When we realize a particle simulation, we need to address certain questions. The first question would be which material we would like to simulate. This is particularly important because we need to know what we would like to consider to be a deformation. For instance, shear is a deformation in an elastic solid, but not in a fluid. Compression would be a deformation for both materials. The next question would be how to get forces from deformations. And here we employ concepts from continuum mechanics. We typically start with displacements at particles. From displacements we compute strain, from strain we get to stress, and then finally to forces. The next question would be how to implement the forces. Here we typically consider some quantities at a particle, but also at the adjacent particles. And in the computation of deformation forces, we often have to approximate spatial derivatives of some quantities at the particles. For instance, in the computation of a compression force, we have to compute the gradient of the pressure field. And in order to compute such derivatives on particle sets, we employ, for instance, smoothed particle hydrodynamics. In the force computation at a particle, we always use information from neighboring particles. So each particle has to know its adjacent particles within a certain distance. And finding these neighbors is an expensive task. Typically, we have a rather large number of particles, we have a rather large number of simulation steps, and the neighbors of all particles have to be estimated in each simulation step. And there we employ spatial data structures, in particular space subdivision. Here the entire simulation domain is subdivided, for instance, into small cubes. All particles are associated with a space cell, and then the neighbor search is restricted to particles in cells that are adjacent to each other. The next interesting question is the reconstruction of the particle trajectories from the computed forces. We know that the force changes the velocity and the velocity changes the position. And here we employ numerical integration schemes to reconstruct particle positions and velocities over time. There exist different numerical integration schemes. The schemes differ in terms of accuracy, robustness, and computation time. And typically we have the goal to get a robust but also efficient and accurate simulation. In the previous slide, I have discussed various aspects that are relevant for particle simulations, and in particular I have mentioned that continuum mechanics can be used to derive forces from deformation. Now here we have an example. We consider the compression of a fluid particle and we would like to compute the respective force that tries to preserve the original volume of a fluid particle. The illustration shows four particles that are too close to each other, and based on the compressed state we would like to compute repulsion forces as indicated by the red arrows. First we consider a strain. We define what we consider as deformation. And here in this case we look at a density difference. We compute the actual density ρ at a fluid particle. We have its rest density ρ0, and now we consider the difference of these two densities. If particles are too close to each other, if they are in a compressed state, then the density ρ is larger than the rest density ρ0, and we get some positive strain epsilon. In a next step, the strain is multiplied with a coefficient to get stress. And in this case, the stress corresponds to the pressure P in a fluid. And finally, we can compute a particle acceleration from pressure P, which is the negative gradient of the pressure divided by the particle density. This term accelerates particles from regions with high pressure to regions with low pressure, and the acceleration is actually part of the Navier-Stokes equation that governs the velocity changes at fluid particles. Now, concepts from continuum mechanics can not only be used to derive compression forces, but they can be used to derive all types of forces that occur in arbitrary materials. Once we know the forces that we would like to consider at a particle, we can implement these forces in a solver. Here on this slide you can see an example of a solver where we consider fluid particles and where we take smooth particle hydrodynamics, abbreviated with SPH, to compute the particle forces. The SPH setting is indicated here in this illustration. In order to compute a force at a particle I, or to reconstruct any quantity at particle I, we need to know the neighboring samples j within a certain distance. And then SPH always computes a sum over these adjacent samples j to compute the respective quantity. Now, a particle solver consists of several steps. As a first step, we always perform a neighbor search. We remember that each particle I has to know its neighbors j in order to compute the forces at a particle with SPH. In the next step, we compute quantities that are required for the force computation. Here in this case, we would like to compute compression forces, and for the compression forces we need to know the actual density ρ at a particle. And here in this density computation we use SPH. We compute a sum over adjacent samples j, where w is a so-called kernel function, which is basically a weighting function that is large if two particles I and j are close to each other, and small or even zero if two particles I and j are farther away. From the actual density at a particle, we can compute the density deviation or compression, which is the difference between current density and rest density. Then we multiply this deviation with a coefficient k, which is user-defined, and we end up with the pressure P at particle I. Now, based on these prerequisites, we compute accelerations at the particles. Here we first compute a viscosity acceleration and gravity. The viscosity acceleration tries to minimize the difference between the velocity of a particle and the average velocity of all particle neighbors. The last acceleration that we compute in this example is the acceleration due to the pressure gradient, the so-called pressure acceleration, with the goal to minimize density deviations in our fluid. And finally, we add up all accelerations at a particle. When we have the overall acceleration at a particle, we can update the particle velocities and finally also the particle positions. Here we see that the update of the velocity uses the time derivative of the velocity, namely the acceleration, and the position update uses the time derivative of the position, which is the velocity. The velocity update corresponds to an explicit Euler update, while the position update is an implicit Euler update, as it uses the time derivative of the position at the next time step t plus delta t. Both updates together are referred to as Euler chroma or symplectic Euler or semi-implicit Euler. So here I have discussed all steps of a particle solver where you can see all the relevant aspects. For the neighbor search, we employ space subdivision. For the density and for the force computations, we use SPH. The pressure formulation bases on continuum mechanics. And finally, we use numerical integration to reconstruct the particle trajectories. In particle simulations, SPH can be used for two types of computations. First, SPH can be used to interpolate quantities at particles, as can be seen here in this example for the density computation. In order to approximate the density at a particle, we just compute a sum over adjacent samples. The second application is the computation of spatial derivatives that are required for force computations, as indicated here for the pressure and the viscosity acceleration. For instance, in order to approximately compute the pressure gradient at a particle, it is just sufficient to compute an SPH sum over adjacent samples. The same holds for the viscosity acceleration. So all terms on the left-hand side of these three equations can be approximately computed with SPH sums. And these approximations are also typically referred to as SPH discretization. We compute approximate values for the density and for the spatial derivatives to end up with accelerations at particles. Here in this example we have two accelerations at fluid particles, but you can imagine that SPH sums can also be used to approximate forces for other materials, for instance elastic solids. In all cases we start with an equation with a term for an acceleration or a force, and then we approximately compute such a term with an SPH sum. In order to compute SPH sums, each particle needs to know its neighbors as indicated in the illustration. These neighbors can change over time, so typically the neighbors of a particle have to be recomputed in each simulation step. So in general, it's a very expensive task. That's why we typically employ spatial data structures to accelerate the search, and one of the data structures is illustrated here in this image. In this case, space is subdivided into cells with a uniform grid, and each of the grid cells gets a unique identifier. And this identifier is computed with respect to some pattern, for instance using a Z-curve that is indicated with the dotted line. Now we place all particles into the respective grid cells. So each particle is associated with exactly one grid cell, and then we store the identifier of the grid cell at each particle. So each particle stores the identifier of the respective grid cell. And in the image, the identifiers are illustrated with the color of the particles. So what do we have now? Particles that share the same cell have the same identifier, and particles in adjacent cells have similar identifiers. If particles are close to each other, they either have the same cell identifier or they have similar cell identifiers. And now in the next step, we sort all particles with respect to their cell identifier, and we get an array that looks like this. Here in this array, we have all particles sorted with respect to their cell identifier. And here you can see that particles and their neighbors are typically rather close to each other, and it is typically rather efficient to estimate the neighbors of a particle in such a sorted array. For the blue particle, for instance, all particles in the same cell have the same cell identifier, and they are adjacent to each other in the sorted array, and other relevant particles in adjacent cells are nearby in the sorted array. The implementation of such a data structure can be really efficient because the grid is not explicitly represented. It is just sufficient to compute a cell identifier per particle. Therefore, we just iterate over the particles and take the particle position. From the particle position, we can deduce the cell and the cell identifier, and finally we sort the particle array. Again, there is no need for an explicit representation of the uniform grid. The grid just illustrates the concept. Another interesting aspect in the simulation of particles is the pressure computation. The pressure computation is particularly relevant in the simulation of fluids, but it can also be relevant in the simulation of elastic solids or when we compute contact forces between rigid bodies. The simplest way for the pressure computation is a state equation where we locally compute the pressure at individual particles from the density deviation at a particle. This computation is simple and efficient. We just iterate over the particles and evaluate the equation for each particle. An alternative idea is to compute pressure in a global way simultaneously at all particles by solving a system. Here we solve the so-called pressure-Poisson equation, and in this equation we start with a constraint at each particle. In the equation, V star indicates the predicted velocity of a particle at the next time step, and P is the unknown pressure that we would like to compute. Now, the equation states that the divergence of the velocity change due to the pressure acceleration should cancel the divergence of the predicted velocity. So the idea is to compute pressure such that the acceleration of the respective pressure gradient corresponds to a velocity change that cancels velocity components in the fluid such that we get a fluid field with zero divergence. And having a divergence-free velocity field corresponds to an incompressible fluid. If there is no divergence in the velocity field, then the time rate of change of the fluid density is zero, which follows from the continuity equation. If the divergence of the velocity field is zero, then the density of the fluid does not change, and we have an incompressible fluid. And now this equation is considered at each particle. And if we take all equations and if we approximate the spatial derivatives with SPH sums, then we get a linear system as indicated here. In this system, the pressure P is unknown, and we solve the system to get the pressure values at all particles. Solving this system seems to be involved, but it turns out that on one hand the matrix is actually sparse, and on the other hand it turns out that we can even implement a solver for this linear system in an entirely matrix-free way. So we do not have to represent a matrix or a sparse matrix, we just implement the solver by storing very few additional values at the particles. So why do we consider these two options for the pressure computation? The state equation is simple and efficient, while the linear solver is certainly more involved and more expensive to compute. Now, the reason for considering the linear system is actually the fact that we can use significantly larger time steps when the pressure is computed by solving the system compared to using a state equation. And when we use larger time steps per simulation step, then the overall computation time for an entire simulation is reduced. We need more time per step, but compute less steps. So overall, this can be more efficient. And that's why we are generally interested in methods that maximize the time steps that we can use in our simulations. So solving a pressure-Poisson equation is actually an interesting alternative to the state equation, and in practice we actually always use the PPE solver because it is faster than the state equation for complex scenes. Another interesting topic for our seminar could be boundary handling. The concept behind boundary handling is not too complex, but the actual implementation can pose various challenges. Also, the realization of the boundary handling influences the accuracy, the robustness, the efficiency, and also the realism of the entire simulation. The idea of boundary handling is indicated in this illustration. We see green fluid particles and gray rigid or boundary particles. And the gray circle around fluid particle xi indicates the neighbors of xi that we consider in SPH computations. And now we see that we have fluid and boundary particles in the neighborhood of particle xi. So in SPH sums, we iterate over fluid neighbors and over boundary neighbors of particle xi. Now, when the particle xi moves closer to the boundary particles, then its density increases and we get a compression at particle xi. From the density deviation, we get a positive pressure at particle xi, and from the pressure gradient, we compute the pressure acceleration, which acts as a repulsion force at particle xi that accelerates the particle away from the boundary particles. Here in this setting, the boundary is represented with several layers of boundary particles. This is due to the fact that SPH sums are only accurate if the entire neighborhood of a particle is filled with other particles. If a fluid particle moves closer to the boundary, we have to make sure that the entire neighborhood of the particle is filled either with fluid or with boundary particles to get an accurate simulation. Using several layers of boundary particles is accurate, but not very convenient. It would actually be much easier to work with just one layer of boundary particles, as indicated in the second illustration. In this case, however, the SPH approximations would be inaccurate for particles close to the boundary. For instance, the SPH computations at particle xi would be erroneous due to missing contributions from missing samples. Now, interestingly, there exist approaches that try to reconstruct the missing information. If you have a fluid particle close to the boundary, and if we know that the boundary is represented with just one layer instead of several layers, then we can model the missing samples and we can try to reconstruct the missing contributions. The next step in improving the flexibility of the boundary representation is to work with boundary samples of different sizes, as illustrated in the next illustration, as indicated in the next illustration. Conceptually, this is not difficult because the volume of a sample is actually considered in SPH sums. So we can easily work with samples of varying size. But the problem that we actually face here is the computation of the volume of such a boundary sample. The boundary samples are generated in the initialization of a particle simulation, and we also typically compute the volume of each boundary particle in the initialization. Now, in the initialization, the neighborhood of a boundary particle is typically incomplete, and the SPH approximations are less accurate. And that's why it can be challenging to accurately estimate the actual volume of boundary particles with non-uniform sizes. Conceptually, we consider the boundary representation on the left-hand side in our simulations, but in practice we work with the boundary representation shown in the image on the right-hand side. And when we use the one-layer representation with non-uniform boundary samples, we have to solve two problems. First, we need to be able to reconstruct missing contributions from missing samples, and second, we need to be able to estimate the actual volume of a boundary sample. Working with one layer of particles with non-uniform size is very flexible and allows to process arbitrarily complex boundary geometries. Here in this slide we have an example of simulated airflow around a car, and in this case the car is our boundary. In order to generate a particle representation for the car, it is sufficient to just more or less arbitrarily place particles on the surface of the car. It is not required to generate several layers, and the boundary particles can be of arbitrary size. So the boundary handling is very flexible and any geometry can be handled. Another important aspect in particle simulations is the reconstruction of particle trajectories based on the applied forces. Therefore we consider two functions, namely positions x over time t and velocities v over time. These two functions represent the motion of a particle. Now for each function we know initial values. We know the position at some time t0 and we know the velocity at that time. In addition, we have two governing equations. We have one equation that describes the time derivative of the position and one equation that describes the time derivative of the velocity. We know that the time derivative of the position is equal to the velocity and the time derivative of the velocity is equal to the acceleration. So for each of the two functions we have an initial value and we have a first-order differential equation that describes the time derivative of that function. And now we need to answer the question how to compute values for the functions x and v at subsequent time steps t plus h, where h is a small time difference or time step. The entire setting is shown in the illustrations. On the left-hand side, we have positions over time. On the right-hand side, we have velocities over time. We know the position at time t0, and we know the time derivative of the position at that time, which is the particle velocity. And now the question is how to reconstruct the unknown function x indicated with the dotted line. In particular, we are interested in computing the position x at time t0 plus h as accurate as possible. One simple idea would be to assume that the particle velocity does not change between t0 and t0 plus h. If the velocity is constant in between the two time points, then we can easily compute x at t0 plus h from the current position plus time step times velocity. That's the simplest numerical integration scheme, referred to as explicit Euler, but you can imagine that there exist alternative, more sophisticated approaches which differ in terms of accuracy and in terms of computation time. And now we are interested in investigating various schemes which can be an interesting topic for the seminar. The illustration on the right-hand side shows the same idea for the velocity. Here we have unknown velocities over time. We know the velocity at time t0, and we are able to compute the time derivative of the velocity, which is the acceleration at time t0. And then the goal is to compute the velocity at time t0 plus h as accurate and as efficient as possible. So far, I have just discussed particle approaches. And now on this slide, I'd like to briefly discuss some relations between particle approaches and grid approaches. Let's start with the illustration on the left-hand side, where we see a particle simulation. We have a fluid volume that is represented with 9 particles that have 9 representative positions indicated with the green spheres. In case of fluid particles, we compute the pressure acceleration, the viscosity acceleration, and the gravity. These accelerations change the velocity of a particle, and the velocity changes its position. We also say that the samples are advected with their velocity. On the right-hand side, we see a grid-based simulation. Here we consider static samples with representative positions, also indicated with green circles. So here the samples do not move with the fluid, but the fluid moves through the samples. But apart from this, the grid approach is very similar to the particle concept. We basically compute accelerations at the static samples. We compute gravity, viscosity, and pressure acceleration. The only difference in the acceleration terms is due to the advection. On the left-hand side, the samples are advected with the fluid volume, and on the right-hand side, the samples are not advected. And this difference in the handling of the sample advection is accounted for with an additional acceleration term in the grid concept. Now, particle and grid approaches also typically differ in the discretization schemes that are used to approximately compute the accelerations. In particle simulations, SPH is a popular choice, while in grid approaches, finite differences are a popular option. In addition to pure particle or pure grid approaches, there also exist hybrid schemes. And here MPM, the material point method, is one example. In this approach, a grid is used for some acceleration terms, while particles are used for the advection. All of these concepts can be used for all types of materials. If you would like to simulate a fluid, we can either take particles or a grid or a hybrid approach. We can use SPH, finite differences, or MPM for the computation of the respective accelerations at particles or at grid cells. Of course, all approaches have benefits and drawbacks. So dependent on the scenario, one concept might be more appropriate than another one. For instance, for free surface simulations with geometrically complex boundaries or with moving boundaries, SPH might be more appropriate. On the other hand, grid approaches are typically considered to be more accurate, and also we do not need to search neighboring samples in grid approaches. But again, in general, all of these concepts can be used for arbitrary material types. Another interesting topic for this seminar would be the simulation of rigid bodies. A rigid body can be interpreted as a set of particles, but these particles do not move relative to each other. And that's why it does not make much sense to simulate individual particles. Instead, rigid bodies are characterized by one representative position and an orientation. And in a simulation, we consider a linear and an angular velocity for a rigid body. Now, forces do not only change the linear velocity of a rigid body, but also its angular velocity. And the angular velocity changes the orientation of a rigid body. Another difference to particles is the mass representation. A particle is just characterized by one scalar mass value, while a rigid body is characterized by a mass distribution within its volume. So in contrast to particles, in rigid body simulations we also consider rotational aspects. And the discussion of the conceptual differences between particles and rigid bodies can be an interesting topic for the seminar. The last topic that I'd like to discuss are bounding volume hierarchies. Bounding volume hierarchies are an alternative to space subdivision. They are useful for collision queries, in particular in the simulation of interacting rigid bodies. The main idea behind bounding volumes is to use simple shapes that encapsulate complex geometries in order to accelerate contact or collision queries between complex geometries. The data structure is illustrated on the left-hand side, and the usage of the data structure is shown on the right-hand side. Bounding volume hierarchies mainly store information about bounding volumes. So in the root node, we store information about a bounding volume that encapsulates the entire geometry. For the next layer of the hierarchy, we split the original geometry, for instance, into two parts, and we compute a bounding volume for each of these two parts. And these two bounding volumes are represented in the hierarchy. This process is recursively applied until we get bounding volumes that encapsulate only very few primitives or triangles of the original geometry. Then we do not further subdivide the geometry, but we just store the respective triangles in the hierarchy. So in all inner nodes in the hierarchy, we store bounding volumes, and at the leaves we store the triangles that represent the object geometry. Now in the illustration on the right-hand side, we see the usage of the bounding volume hierarchy in a collision query. We have two triangulated objects and we would like to find out whether these objects intersect or not. Now for both objects we have generated a bounding volume hierarchy. In a first step we check whether the bounding volumes of the root nodes overlap. If these bounding volumes would not overlap, then we could actually conclude that the enclosed objects also do not intersect. In the example, however, the bounding volumes overlap, and therefore we continue our test by considering the children of the two root nodes. Each root node has two children, so we have two bounding volumes in one hierarchy and two bounding volumes in the second hierarchy. And these four bounding volumes are tested against each other. So we have four intersection tests, and in this example we find out that two of the bounding volumes from different hierarchies overlap. We recursively continue this process. Whenever we find intersecting bounding volumes from different hierarchies, we check whether the respective children overlap. If we have reached the leaves of the bounding volume hierarchies, then we check the respective triangles. In each leaf there are only very few triangles, so we just test a comparatively small number of triangles for overlap. There exist various aspects that can be discussed in the context of bounding volume hierarchies. For instance, we can use different types of bounding volumes. Here in this slide we see spheres, but alternatively we can also use different types of boxes. And all bounding volume types have benefits and drawbacks. In dynamic simulations, for instance, where objects move or deform, the bounding volume hierarchies have to be generated or updated in each simulation step. And in this context, the bounding volume type significantly influences the performance of the data structure. That's it about the topics. So in the animation seminar, you can either talk about particle approaches, you can talk about grid approaches, or you can present hybrid approaches. You can talk about the simulation of fluids, elastic solids, or rigid bodies. You can also talk about specific aspects of simulations, for instance, numerical integration, neighbor search, pressure computation, or boundary handling. Alternatively, you can also talk about continuum mechanics, or you can present a data structure, for instance, data structures that are used for space subdivision or for bounding volume hierarchies. So you can either choose from the discussed topics, or you can choose a topic that is related to the discussed animation topics. So the idea of the seminar is to choose an animation topic, to present this topic, and to prepare a report about the topic. The presentation should be between 25 and 35 minutes, and the report should have about 10 pages. The report should be very closely related to the presentation. Please note again that the overview of the topics, the links to relevant material, and also the presentation dates can be found on our webpage in the teaching section. Thanks for your attention.